honored to introduce Tom Schiffer, our speaker. He's our Vice President of the Boone County Historical Society. He also serves on the board of a local government agency called the Boone County Historic Preservation Review Board. And he's the author of several books. We have them here at the library. One is Peters and King. It's the history of the Peters Cartridge Company and the King Powder Company. And another book he's written is the Ohio Gun Collectors Association, the first 75 years. We also have a copy of that in the library. And Tom was raised in Kent County. He spent most of his professional life working in Cincinnati. He's got a Bachelor of Science degree from UK in industrial management. He spent many years as an environmental manager at Emery Industries. He served as president of the National Muzzle Loading Rifle Association. He's been chairman of the board of the Annie Oakley Foundation and secretary and vice president of the Boone County Historical Society back in the 1980s. Now he's our current vice president. He did, for the past decade, he has pursued boating in his 2 steam-powered launches exploring Boone County, and he'll have one of those boats at our Boone County Heritage Day in July. He also brought it last year at the Boone County Heritage Day in Burlington, and people were fascinated with the boat. Besides books, he's written extensively for widely circulated periodicals, and most recently, he's done extensive writing under the direction of Bridget Stryker, the Boone County Local History Coordinator. He's maintained an avid interest in photography. He's married to Carol. There's Carol. She's on our board, and they live in Boone County. Now let's welcome Tom for his program on General George Marshall.
Thank you, Pat. I've got the easy job tonight. When Betsy isn't here, she leaves the instructions, and we have to follow. And if we stray, please don't tell. Anyway, again, thanks for coming tonight. And the subject of the talk is George C. Marshall, George Catlett Marshall. He has roots in Kentucky in that his father and mother were born in Augusta and spent their life there. But George Marshall was born and spent his younger years in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, which is in the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania. So with your indulgence, I will sit down and run through this presentation. Can you all hear me?
No. I'll get something to put down.
Does this work?
No.
This presentation will cover George Marshall Jr.'s formative years beyond a simple catalog of his very noteworthy accomplishments on the national and later world stage. After that is far beyond the scope of this talk, and very likely your patience. Besides, we have to be out of here by noon tomorrow. I can hold it like this, is it? Okay. George C. Marshall Jr. was born December 31st, 1880. He was the youngest of 3 surviving siblings. Stuart was 6 years older, and Mary was 4 years his senior. George Marshall Sr. was a stern father and favored his son Stuart, as Stuart was a good student and showed promise of being a worthy successor to his father's business. George was not. Little George and Stuart were never close, and Mary was a girl who tattled on her little brother. George became the only child at home and the apple of Louisa's eye. She shielded little George from his father's wrath at his very poor grades and pranks, which might bring shame to the Marshall name. This was pretty much an ongoing effort. And it seems that there was more than a little for George's sister to tattle about. There were quite a number of boyish pranks. In later years, there was something about an illegal chicken fight. This is the Marshall home in Uniontown, in the southwest corner of Pennsylvania, and they were above middle class in wealth. And he, Senior, was he owned coke plants that fueled the iron industry. One thing that infuriated his father was George's claiming at school that the Marshalls were descended from the pirate Bluebeard, and not, distantly, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, Governor Branford, and the Catletts. His middle name he hated. These names were well known in Kentucky and Virginia, where the Marshalls' roots were. Both of George's parents were from Augusta, Kentucky. It is hard for this writer to imagine a more impossible and tragic situation for a small boy with a mischievous glint in his eye than having an older sister who is a tattletale. I cannot think of any legal way out of such a dilemma. One might say it was good training for tragic and impossible situations later in life, but at the time the only possibility was to live through it. But a greater tragedy awaited George's graduation from high school. George said later he was not a poor student, but that he was no student at all. The family was Southern in its outlook, and his parents selected Virginia Military Institute as his college, as they had for his brother Stuart before him. Stuart had distinguished himself there, and when he heard brother George was to go there, vehemently objected. George's poor academic habits would bring disgrace to the Marshall name. George happened to overhear this exchange and was mortified. He decided then and there that he would make them proud of his tenure at VMI. He improved his academics to where he stayed in the middle of the pack at VMI, but he became first corporal in his second year, first sergeant in his third year, and first captain in his senior year. These are the highest rankings they could reach in each year. He fell in love in his senior year with a woman some 6 years senior to him, Elizabeth Carter Coles. Known as Lily, she was the belle of the campus, and his brother Stuart had dated her when he was at VMI. But he needed a job if they were to marry. A rare commission in the regular army would do it, he surmised. But he had to qualify to even sit for the examination. He was so determined he went to Washington on his own, and shy as he was, slipped in to see the president. The president pulled strings and he got his commission, and they were married on February 11th, 1902 at the family home in Virginia. After a week's honeymoon, he was posted alone to the Philippines on the tail end of the insurrection as the occupying force. A raw shave tail, George found scorpions, crocodiles, a cholera epidemic, and bored regular army troops. Leading a patrol one day, crossing a deep stream, single file, someone shouted, "Crocodile!" and the troops stampeded over their officer. If this was done to find if the new officer had any steel in his spine, they would not be long in doubt. George picked himself up, called the troops to attention, and ordered them to follow me. Now we're missing a slide here, but I'll tell you what happened. He picked himself up and called the troops to attention, and when he said, "Follow me," he plunged into the stream and went back across. And when he got to the first side they were on, he turned around and went back yet again and established a crude degree of discipline among the men. They knew who was boss. A gangling 6-foot skinny boy was now beginning to fill out as a commanding figure. And later in life, when George entered a room, he occupied it without saying a word. After his tour was up, he was posted to Fort Reno in the Oklahoma Territory, a throwback to the Indian War days. Too arid and primitive for Lily's delicate health due to a heart condition. George applied to go to the Infantry and Cavalry School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Newly taken over by General Bell, it was being grossly revised from the old methods to deal with something besides horses and mules for transport and the wireless instead of the telegraph and messengers. Instructor John Morrison introduced new tactical methods derided by the old school. Nothing had changed in so many years that other arriving officers had class notes, copies of tests, and George knew he'd have to study as never before. He had no such aids. In speculating who would be in the top half of the class, George was completely overlooked. And this was his brother Stuart's scorn all over again. By dint of very hard work, he finished top man in his class, thus assured of being there for the second year. When it was over, his best takeaway was that he had learned how to learn, analyze problems, and make decisions. He made first lieutenant in 1907. George came to the attention of General Bell, Army Chief of Staff, and finishing first in his class was picked to spend time training National Guard troops in Bell's newer concept over the summer between class years. He was then in his second year of Staff College in 1908 before he even heard of what the Wright brothers did at Kitty Hawk in 1903. He heard it in a lecture by Lieutenant B.D. Floyd, dismissed by many who thought him a crank, who thought it would radically alter military tactics. A bit later, on July 30th, 1908, Marshall witnessed Orville Wright attempt to get an Army contract for Wright flyers by circling Fort Myer in one with Lieutenant B.D. Floyd as a passenger. George interviewed his friend from Leavenworth, Lieutenant Floyd. Both of them were Morrison men, officers supporting the new concept of tactics. Ever after, Marshall supported aircraft as a weapon of war. Floyd went on to become General of the Air Service, and at one time was the Air Service. He's shown here with Orville Wright in 1909. George was selected to stay on as an instructor. And for the next 2 years, he and Lily had an ideal life there as an olive drab reflection of upper-class America. Lecture in the morning, in the afternoons for riding, tennis, walking, or whatever. Assignment ending in 1910, George and Lily toured Europe on the cheap. This was a lieutenant's meager salary. He did it for 5 months. Back home, George was there in time to see the Army maneuvers, 16,000 men on the Mexican border. Friends got him posted to the Signal Corps where he could observe the use of the new wireless communications and the use of airplanes. The exercise showed the Army was not capable of fast mobilization. George was tapped in 1912 to organize a joint exercise of the Army with the National Guard, some 17,000 men. A rousing success, Marshall got a lot of the credit. He was still a lowly lieutenant. As such, he was posted back to the Philippines where his rank only qualified him to command a platoon, about 30 men. While there, a fortunate series of events and manipulation by friends placed him as acting chief of staff under a colonel who was woefully inept, but agreed to let George run the show in directing the mock invading force in an exercise. His actions not only saved face for the colonel, but carried the day. Throwing himself into the breach at the 11th hour cost him dearly in having to spend 2 weeks in hospital to recover his health. This event showed George his limitations as to stamina. He adopted a regimen that assured his ability to cope. He rationed his time that assured an hour's horseback ride before breakfast, tennis in the afternoons, and time to relax in the evenings. How he managed to even remotely adhere to such a schedule in later years is a monument to his wisdom, fortitude, and managerial ability. Even assured of the above, the crushing weight of responsibility and demands on his time he faced later on would have killed a lesser man early on. Harry Truman famously said, "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." You will see as this tale unfolds, his country increasingly built a kitchen around George C. Marshall. His love of country and sense of duty kept him in the kitchen long after others would have hung up their spurs and retired. After recovery, George and Lily traveled to Japan, where, as guest of the Japanese Army, he toured the battlefields of the Russo-Japanese War. This was a busman's holiday. It was in this general period he almost resigned his commission due to the stagnation of advancement in the U.S. Army. He was rusticating in an area remote from the action, which was now on the border with Mexico, and he longed to be there when General Pershing chased Pancho Villa through Mexico. But General Bell tapped him to become a staffer to train civilian businessmen to become commissioned officers in San Francisco, thence to Utah under General Lieutenant Colonel Haygood, who on George's efficiency report said he would be happy to serve under his subordinate. Meanwhile, a world war was squandering a generation of young men in Europe, with Kaiser Wilhelm locked in battle with the French and his English royalty cousins. President Wilson was trying to keep us out of it, but he was becoming obvious he could not. After over 30 months of mindless slaughter, the U.S. was in it. Mustard or chlorine gas, bullets from machine guns, artillery shells, barbed wire, bombs from the air, cold, rain, mud, heat, dust, free clothes and shoes that came in two sizes, too large and too small, summer clothing in the cold of winter, trench foot, flu, free travel to exotic foreign places, the smell of death, boredom alternating with abject terror. What was not to like? At Persian Headquarters, George found his old friend George Patton Jr. in charge of security. He found himself billeted in Gondricourt, some distance away. He found a private home of Mrs. Jouett, a very good cook, and her older husband, and invited fellow officers to join him in staying there. In October, General Seibert, bearing the brunt of Pershing's wrath at the slow progress of the 28th, Marshall exploded at Pershing for his unfair act. George's friends thought he would be sent home. George cataloged the overwhelming problems they had to solve every day. Lack of supplies, sleeping quarters, shoes, all delivered in rapid-fire order, all facts. Pershing didn't like it, but he listened, and it bought time to get essential training done, and Marshall stayed on. At Pershing's headquarters, he found his old friend Patton, as we said before, in charge of security. Later, he would be put in charge of tanks. George found himself billeted in Gondricourt, and he found in a private home as we spoke. In response to a German attack in March 1917, Marshall was the architect of the first American initiative of the war. Well rehearsed for a week behind the lines, it came off like unopposed clockwork. Before it started, Marshall's horse fell, rolled twice, and broke George's ankle. The 28th occupied the Germans' old position and resisted stubbornly 7 counterattacks. German General Ludendorff mounted his spring 1918 offensive using the 100 German divisions, the Eastern Front, after the Russian collapse, to reinforce the Western Front. His gigantic thrust sputtered and stopped with 400,000 German casualties. That summer, Marshall was transferred to Pershing's headquarters. An emotional goodbye from his officer comrades in arms of the 28th was rendered especially nostalgic, since most of those very same officers who had bid him goodbye were killed in the following week. The U.S. troops got caught in political wrangle created by involvement with 2 other countries, France and England. Marshall was asked to sketch an impossible logistical move consisting of 2,700 artillery pieces, and 400,000 men from the St. Mihiel assault, some 60 miles to the Meuse-Argonne. This was to be done in secret, at night, in rain, over muddy roads already churned by countless wheels and hooves, along with the necessary food, ammunition, field hospitals, maintenance, and other support groups, and their equipment. The troops moved had been engaged on the front lines the day before. They were to be replaced by 200,000 exhausted French troops into the trenches and evacuated by the troops to be moved. Upon arrival, they would be expected to fight again the morning after arrival, and some would have had to march the 60 miles. After some hand-wringing, Marshall called for a stenographer, dictated rapid fire for less than an hour, and turned his draft to the general, drum and Pershing. It was accepted, and Marshall made it work. While Marshall did none of the actual fighting, and he never again led troops in battle, the Allied enemies were placed in a very advantageous position to finish their work, and finish it they did. Much of the credit for the logistical move and follow-up moves was given to George C. Marshall. He got a new nickname, Wizard. If George was horrified by the thought of war before World War I, and he was doubly so after seeing men gasping from mustard gas, coughing up green vomit, only to rot in nursing homes for the rest of their lives when they got home. More troops piled on heaps, living and dead, that were feasted on by rats between the lines. He let his scorn spill over on those he felt allowed this to happen. The U.S. Army was unprepared for it. There were people then, as now, who felt tax money should go to us for social programs, repairing infrastructure. The military was only good in peacetime to stage spectacular funerals for dignitaries. God knows they had enough practice, but mostly practice on the poor grunts who were victims of the unpreparedness. The German army was caught by complete surprise. Even though entrenched in positions perfected over 4 static years in that sector, they were bleeding from losses that were not replaced. On November 11th, 1918, they gave up. This is still known as Armistice Day. And those are some statistics there from World War I. 5 years later, George wrote in retrospection, everywhere on the battlefield, individuals were paying the price of long years of national unpreparedness. They paid with their lives and limbs for the bullheaded obstinacy with which our people had opposed any rational system of training in time of peace, and with which the Congress reflected this attitude. This was not the first time the nation went to sleep, nor would it be the last. Some officers, like Marshall's fellow planner during the war, Fox Connor, known in the Army as an intellectual, knew that there would eventually be another war. This was because he saw the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Connor and Pershing were two who groomed and nurtured promising officers for the coming fray. Marshall and Eisenhower were the two most prominent. When Pershing retired in 1924, Marshall spent 3 years in China guarding a railroad with the U.S. 15th Army. A coterie of Chinese warlords were jousting for prominence there, but U.S. troops were allowed to do little. Marshall mastered the Chinese language to the point where he could easily understand casual conversations. This was a 2.5-year course in 11 months. Lily was with him, and he jokingly said, spent the 3 years on a shopping trip for their home. Lily developed a goiter, and when they returned to the States, complications after an operation caused her death in 1927. George was stricken after over a quarter century of happily married life. Persian tried to console him as he himself had lost his wife and daughters in a tragic fire before the war. Home from China, Marshall accepted a request to lecture at the War College. This was ironic because he never had an opportunity to attend that school. He was engaged in this when Lily passed away. Racked with grief, Marshall was offered several posts to channel his grief into useful work. He accepted the post of Assistant Commander of Fort Benning, Georgia Infantry School. This was a school for company grade officers. This was fortunate because Marshall's efforts trained officers at the entry level. 150 of them would become generals of the Army in the next 20 years. Marshall hit the ground running at Fort Benning, having seen firsthand the result of inept company grade officers. He set about changing that. Gray said Marshall had a reputation for a wicked memory for outstanding or poor performances. His reputation as ruthless in his personnel assignments, and because of his 5-year lecture there at Benning, was the breeding ground for the commanders of World War II. Omar Bradley, one of the instructors, said of Marshall, Bradley, learned the rudiments of effective command. After having assigned an officer to his job, you left him to do his job. General Marshall seldom intervened. If a man performed, you let him alone. If not, you either bucked him up or sacked him. Invited to a dinner party in 1929, George found himself a dinner partner to an attractive, outgoing, independent widow with 3 nearly grown children. She was the widow of a murdered, successful lawyer in New York. After much give and take banter over dinner, George asked if he could take her home to where she was staying with a Mrs. Blanchard who lived in nearby Columbus, Georgia. Continuing interesting conversation after an hour of riding about town, she asked, after 2 years, haven't you learned your way around Columbus? He replied, extremely well, or I could not have stayed off the street where Mrs. Blanchard lives. Ever the campaign strategist, he subtly revealed his interest. After a year or so of campaigning, he married Catherine Tupper Brown on October 15, 1930. Marshall's home became a mecca for his friends, and he became a contented man again. He and his wife rode horseback every afternoon. He became a real father to her 3 children. He became more attuned to the needs of his friends
and fellow officers and continued to improve the instruction at Fort Benning. As the 1930s advanced, Marshall had long since emerged from the status of no student at all to an astute observer and quick study. His integrity was unquestioned, and he became noted for his tact and diplomacy. His sense of responsibility and duty were legendary, having accomplished things few general officers ever dream of doing. Marshall was still only a colonel. From June of 1932 until July of 1938, Marshall was commander of several successful CCC camps in Georgia, South Carolina, and Washington State. These were fun years for a man who sincerely believed that a citizen army, universal military training, enjoyed hunting and fishing, but he also served a stint as the senior instructor of the Illinois National Guard in the middle of it. He was promoted to colonel and then brigadier general in this period. Here we see Marshall and Catherine on a fishing trip in the Northwest. But it was not to last. Japan invaded China and Manchuria in the 1930s. Germany invaded Poland, Luxembourg, and France in 1939, and Russia in 1941, in spite of non-aggression treaties. This was what Chamberlain found in Peace in Our Time with Hitler. Hitler marched into Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia. France fell by 1940, and over 300,000 of the British Army was evacuated from Dunkirk. England was subjected to the Blitz, and here you see the Tower Bridge. Roosevelt was walking on eggs with a Republican Congress that wanted to stay out of the fray. Marshall had to make a military budget of a balanced military, and Roosevelt wanted 15,000 aircraft per year. Marshall used Harry Hopkins to bring Roosevelt around. Aircraft were useless without pilots, landing fields, maintenance, and personnel, and the aircraft would take up the entire budget. In April of 1939, Marshall was chosen by Roosevelt to be the Army's Chief of Staff. In this position, he served through World War II and was organizer and promoter that increased the Army size from 174,000 to over 11 million in the Army, 4,200,000 in the Navy, and 660,000 in the Marine Corps, a grand total of about 16 million men. At the time Marshall took office, the U.S. military ranked 19th among the world nations, less than the size of Portugal's military. Under his direction, the U.S. became the most powerful nation in the world. In World War II, Marshall was the glue that held together the Allied forces that defeated Germany, Italy, and Japan's Axis powers. He used personal integrity, sense of duty, selfless service, blunt talk, diplomacy, tact, organizational ability, statesmanship, and leadership to weld Roosevelt, the U.S. Congress, England's Churchill, and Russia's Stalin into an effective military force to defeat the enemy. Books have been written on how he did this. It is beyond the scope of my talk to study this in detail. Roosevelt said of him, "I could not sleep at night with him out of Washington." And that was the reason he didn't lead the troops at D-Day. Churchill said of him, if perhaps he, Marshall, was the greatest Roman of them all. Stalin said, "I would trust General Marshall with my life." Truman said of him, "He is the greatest living American." Henry L. Stimson, Secretary of War, said to him, "Sir, you are the finest soldier I ever knew." On the suggestion that Marshall was acting in his role of dealing with all of these prima donnas, a staffer said, "Yes, but you always knew when General MacArthur was acting." On December 7th, 1941, all doubt was removed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the U.S. declared war on Japan. Churchill said, only half in jest, "After exhausting all other possibilities, the Americans will do the right thing." This is Winston in 1895. Germany then declared war on the U.S. and the race was on. The race to arm and fight was on. Off to see the world again. These are some views from World War II. After 4 years of bloody fighting, more for some of our allies, the war came to an end in August of 1945. Here the Japanese were signing the surrender on the battleship Missouri. And here's some statistics from World War II. Out of a world population of 1,899,000,000, 24 million military and 37 million civilians died. The war over, the boys came home, and we demobilized yet again. You find a good horse and you're riding to death. War ends in August of 1945. Within a month of being 65, Marshall retires in November of 1945. Called back after 2 days as special emissary to China by Truman, and called back from China in 1947 to become Secretary of State. In June 1947, Marshall gave the Marshall Plan speech at Harvard University. In 1948, he was selected by Time magazine as Man of the Year for the second time. In 1948, July to December, was the Berlin airlift, and I won't go into that, but that's how we supplied Berlin by air when the Russians wouldn't blockaded our land deal. December 1948, he had his kidney removed, and he resigns as Secretary of State. He was then appointed President of the American Red Cross. In June 1950, the Korean War began. In September 1950, he was appointed Secretary of Defense, which is equivalent of Secretary of War in the situation. April through June 1951, Marshall was attacked by Senator Joseph McCarthy. In September 1951, he resigns as Secretary of Defense. December 1953, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And this is the way that Bill Malden honored the chief of the Army in World War II upon his death in 1959. Because he did retire, and he went to the estate that they had bought for their retirement, and they tended the garden there, which he and his wife both loved. And he passed away in 1959, and he did not have an elaborate funeral at his own request. And this is a man who had organized the funeral for Woodrow Wilson and for President Roosevelt. But he did lay in state in the National Cathedral at Eisenhower's insistence, and he was tended by members of the armed forces, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Army, and the Marine Corps. And that concludes my story. So thank you for listening, and do you have any